thank you for coming to this last session. It has been a very long day. And I'd like to warmly welcome our speakers. We have a great panel today, and I will enjoy it very much. My name is Sara Roda. I am a researcher at the VUB, and I will be moderating this panel. The time is a little bit strict, so we have short presentations after a brief introduction, then the questions from the audience, and we'll have 5 minutes of closing remarks. Today's panel is about children's privacy online. It's something that we don't discuss sufficiently. Children today are exposed to a digital environment, and this can have vast implications and sometimes long-term consequences to their well-being and also to their lives in general. We see today identification of their lives, and without any possibility or very little possibility to opt out. It starts at home, early age, as entertainment. It continues at school with several education tools and platforms which are required for children to learn. And then it continues with when they become adults, when they enter into the labor market. The general data protection gives us some recommendations, some guidelines that could have an impact, a positive one, we hope, on how we should deal with privacy for children. One of these safeguards is a requirement to have parental consent. So children required under the age of 16, when entities are processing personal data, sometimes the threshold of this limit is lower. So under the age of 16, you need parental consent, or under the age of 13. But this might not be enough. Children still have access to age-inappropriate online content. Healthy surveillance of parents and schools is difficult to ensure. We have to find a way not to undermine their ability to express themselves and also to make mistakes. How do we do this in a proportionate manner? And screen time is also not tackled enough. So our questions today is: what does children privacy mean today? What recommendations can we give? What are the industry's best practices? And could, for example, the shutdown law that exists in Korea could be of interest in Europe, where we see that online gaming, the access to online gaming is not allowed between midnight and 6 a.m. for children under the age of 16. Well, our speakers come from different areas: academia, civil society, regulator, legal, and industry, and they will bring their perspective into this debate. First, she is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and author of several books, including the class Living and Learning in the Digital Age, Sonia Livingstone. Then she's the director of Defenddigitalme, a not-for-profit organization founded by her and aimed at protecting children's privacy in the education sector in England and beyond, Persson. Then third, he's the Innovation and Foresight Project Manager at the Department of Technologies and Innovation at CNIL. He's a member of LINK, a research and experimentation platform that proposes to push forward digital innovation, Régis Chatellier. Fourth, she jointly heads the International Privacy and Data Protection Group at Bird & Bird, an international law firm, and she's a well-known lawyer in the area of data protection, Ruth Boardman. And finally, he is the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs of the Interactive Software Federation of Europe, the association that represents the European video games industry. He leads the government affairs program of PEGI, the organization that manages the pan-European age rating system for video games, Jürgen, Bänsch. So welcome everyone. The work that you are doing is remarkable, and I give the floor to Sonia.
Shall I? I'll go there because I need to change the slides, yeah. So thank you so much, Sara, for putting this panel together, and to everyone for coming and focusing on children and the issues of data and privacy that affect them. So I'm going to talk about a research project that we've been doing at LSE called Children's Data and Privacy Online, and it was funded by the British DPA, the Information Commissioner. So I'm very grateful to their funding. And I want to start by showing you an advertisement that was recently plastered over the bus stops and buildings of Britain, and perhaps also other countries, I don't know, which I have been puzzling about, and which seemed to me to encapsulate at least one of the problems of how it is that we all talk about privacy in everyday life, and how, therefore, children come to understand their privacy and the questions that arise. So I'm assuming that this advert is in some sense in response to the pressures that Facebook and other big companies are under since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and the rising concerns among the public about questions of privacy. And I think it's a puzzling advertisement. I don't know if anyone here is on social media but follows nobody and has nobody following them, because everything is private only to me. But I wondered what that only me means. And I'm also curious about the other options. So Cambridge Analytica has given rise to all kinds of anxieties about data. I've been discussing Cambridge Analytica with children from the age of 11. First of all, wanted people to know that children do care about their privacy. And it's because they have so little choice, especially granular choice, meaningful choice, about how to engage interpersonally, that they give away their data, as it were, or that they seem to be insensitive to privacy questions, but they are not. They have a lot of questions. Being children, they would like to know quite now what happens to their data when they die, where does their information go, why are they selling information, what is happening. And at this point, to try to help them understand, my team and I, we did a lot of searching online for a child-friendly explanation of where data goes. Like, what does the data ecology look like? And it is very hard to find any way in which it is described to any of us, in fact, what that data ecology of multiple data brokers as part of a transnational commercial environment, what does that look like? And what are the points at which you might exercise your rights? Because we tell children they may have their rights in relation to the body that they gave their data to knowingly, but they have no idea what that subsequent series of organisations are. And the idea that children are going to go to Experian or Oracle or whichever those other organisations are and demand their rights is missing an understanding of the nature of childhood. So what did we do, just to finish up? Well, we built a toolkit at myprivacy.uk. I've put some flyers at the back, and I have some things to just hand out to help you remember myprivacy.uk. We said UK because the resources are in English and they apply in the UK, but I think they have some wider ramifications. So we tried to answer in the toolkit children's questions. They wanted to know what's the issue about online privacy? Who has my data? So we offered some answers. Who's tracking me? What are my rights? What can go wrong? What do children want to happen? How can they protect their privacy? Where can they get information? And there were a lot of people in this world who have designed some great videos and games, so we've linked as many of those. And we did make a video ourselves, which I invite you to look at, but I don't think I'll play it because I think I'm out of time. But it's fun. And we tried to tell children, but where does their data go, and what are their rights in relation, and what can go wrong, because they need to know, and they need to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I hope, if the slides are available afterwards, maybe people can see. And one of the sentences that you had mentioned in your article, and I think it's a very good picture that I liked, was that you mentioned today's children are the canary in the coal mine of our datafied society. I think this picture grabs a lot of things that you have discussed.
Right.
Okay. And,
Okay. Well, Sara, will the film be automatic? Okay, in a minute. All right. So hello, thank you for having me. As Sonia said, it's so important that children's voices are heard in this debate, and we're grateful that this event is happening. But so it's also difficult to actually hear children's own voices in their own terms. So over the summer, we worked at Defenddigitalme with a youth group in England, and we would like to play you some of the questions they have.
In the summer of 2019, young people in Finland and England collaborated with UNICEF, Designing for Children's Rights, and Defenddigitalme on workshops to understand a day in the life of their online experiences and use of their personal data. Here's what they had to say.
Is it even possible to be completely anonymous on the internet?
My data is not anybody's to sell. Why does anyone think it's acceptable?
I don't like it when companies sell my data to third parties, but I do like it that the services are free.
Just how personalized is the news I see?
So that's just a flavour of the work that we did over the summer to prepare with the youth group in their own voices, how they wanted to be heard at a conference at the end of September together with UNICEF and other organisations. As you saw, the groups were both from Finland and England. The questions of identity and anonymity, privacy and commercial exploitation, and how children maintain their fundamental rights really are things that they care about. And I'd like us this year to absolutely dispel the myth, as Sonia does so well in her work, that children don't care about privacy. What they constantly say to us is just, how do we assert our own agency? How can we actually decide that we can assert our rights? And what are those rights? Our work focuses in the education sector in England, but much of what happens in education in terms of commercial uses and applications in education in England are also exported. And there are very similar apps and platforms that operate globally. We operate on a very practical basis. So as an organization, we also accept complaints from parents and teachers, and we hear of case studies where things have either gone wrong or where staff and parents have questions around what their rights are and how they should be operating in a school. So this session that I will contribute to is focused entirely on education. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, in their Aims of Education report, as far back as 2001, said, we must remember, children do not lose their human rights by virtue of passing through the school gates. The question is, they may have those rights, but can they actually exercise them? And how are they respected? In education, the types of data collection that go on are often hidden and opaque. There are various applications of data collection, and the overarching theme of the event here at CPDP is on data protection and artificial intelligence. So given that we have limited time, I'm going to focus on that. The school tasks, the administrative tasks, the behind-the-scenes tasks that schools use personal data from children about tend to be hidden and opaque to a child. They're things that the school must do to perform their daily administration. Take an example where schools have an obligation to safeguard children. Now, in England, we have a very particular law and piece of legislation that was brought in 2015, safeguarding children online. And to do so, many schools, we estimate over 70% from our own research, and that would be aligned with what the companies claim themselves, apply safeguarding in schools software. This monitors everything that children type online. It monitors their keystrokes. It matches what they search for in an internet search against thousands of words in opaque libraries. Children don't know what these search terms are, but they certainly flag some very strange things to children and certainly are problematic for teachers. One example, a teacher came to us and said, we have a boy who has been flagged because he was looking up black rhinos. He's now been flagged by the system as a potential gang member. A second was looking for cliffs, and the girl has been flagged as a potential suicide risk. Now, if children don't know that these systems operate, they certainly can't exercise their rights to get those errors, those simply wrong and incorrect assertions made about them removed. Schools, with the best interest of the children at heart, are risk-averse. The teacher came to us because he said, my senior staff will not delete these records because they're concerned that if the child ever should come to harm, we would be held accountable for not having done anything with this data. The fact that it's simply a mistake is very hard to assert from the teacher's perspective without drawing a whole set of conclusions and implications involving that child. And what effect does that discussion alone have on that developing child and the relationship that they have with the school? The other area that artificial intelligence are commonly employed in England for teachers is classroom and behaviour monitoring. So if your child has misbehaved in class, they could find that an app is using AI to measure and profile their children's behaviour. If they behave badly, the app might even make a sound in the classroom to point out a negative sound. So there's peer pressure being brought in around data collection and profiling that happens that's permanent as well. And these permanent records are not only stored by the school, but in hundreds of commercial applications. AI is often used as well, increasingly, in learning and what you would think of that actually touches the child in their day-to-day interactions with the school in terms of their own teaching and learning. But again, we have to question, do children and do schools fully understand the implications of this? Companies in England, for example, today claim that they operate on the basis of consent. Now, the rulings in Sweden and in France over the summer around the use of facial recognition would suggest that consent is a very weak basis for routine data collection in schools. In fact, I would go so far as to say it doesn't work at all. Also because children are the data subjects, and partly because schools are simply in the position of power that children cannot make an informed choice around using these types of app or not. Jose Ferreira, who was the CEO of Newton in 2012, made a statement at the Datapalooza back then and said, education is by far the most mined industry. And in 30 years, it's the amount of data that was going to be mined will be unrecognizable. The introduction of AI, platforms, apps, and technology to the classroom has introduced a huge number of commercial actors into the child's education. Some of them may work very well. We tend to hear in our field about the things that don't work so well. But we certainly don't hear enough questioning around how do they work? How are companies showing that they have error rates? Are they transparent, whether they are having the effect that was intended? Do those effects have unintended consequences? Who's researching that they're actually doing what they say on the tin? And do we want them to do that at all? What effects do they have about gathering all this data about children and then inferring, as one AI company in England has recently claimed, that the company knows that the child is autistic? So we talk a lot about this type of conference in terms of FAT, for example, fairness, accountability, transparency. But explainability to a child is a very different type of concept that we really have to address more attention to. And when it comes to practice in education, where the imbalance of power is so different from whether you choose to use an app on your phone or not at home, we really have to, I think, spend more time and attention on how we do that. And we would like to see a very different approach in terms of the education system on how we present children with their understanding of how data about them are used, whether it's in administration, in their learning, or for other tasks that happen beyond the school gates, so that we can make sure that their rights are not left as soon as they do enter a school ground.
Hello, I'm Régis Chatellier. I'm an Innovation and Foresight Project Manager at CNIL. Today we'll talk about many different things, but about our mission as an Innovation Foresight team, as a consultation we will run in the weeks to go, and on the interest of working on the interface design with the children. First of all, I'm part of the CNIL's Digital Innovation Lab, and we are a specific team in the CNIL. We are neither lawyer nor technologist, and our mission is to explore, experiment, and discuss different subjects through publications. And for the last 8 years, we have published some eight innovation and foresight reports on different topics. And we have a website which is link.cnil.fr, on which we publish some articles, on different issues. And around the children, we have published 2 years ago one article which was privacy and ethical concerns in learning analytics, and why should we remain alert to digitalization and new techniques in education, more or less what you was talking about, and how should we be more aware of the specific risk for the children. One other example was about video game, and video game as the first entry in the digital world for many children, and it's not the browser and the going to search on the internet. And sometimes, we did a small survey some months ago, and we saw that if the children know that they go through on the internet with video games, it's not the case. It's the case of their parents. That's why we have to think about these specific topics and the status of the video games, who are not sometimes part of the information society, and they are not obliged to have the consent of the children. And that's why we think we have to put these questions on the table, and not to give an answer today, but it's part of our reflections. And regarding the CNIL, the children's privacy, it's a hot topic these days, because in 2019 we have launched a general reflection on the rights of minors and the conditions for the exercise of their rights. First of all, we have tried to work with the players concerned, such as public and private players, parents, professionals, and the defender of rights, which is in charge of the rights of the children, not only on the data protection, but all the rights of the children, when with some 10 members of the collective who have been associated. And in 2020, we will launch a public consultation, maybe next week or the week after, I don't know exactly, with the objective, which is to collect the opinions of interested parties on the exercise of the rights attached to children's data. I think you have many issues. We are not the first data protection authority to work like this. You had the consultation of the ICO, and they have published their conclusion today. But our public consultation will have four chapters. First one will be on the ability of a minor to perform certain actions on alone. Can the children do everything on the internet? How to verify the age of users and to obtain consent, because we know that the key point of verifying the age, it's really important, because you have many ways to do it, using artificial intelligence, inference, or just to declare that you are not a children. And we haven't seen any good solution at this point. and how to obtain the consent. And in this specific point, I think the design of the interface could be a good idea to explore to make it better. Third one was the establishment of additional guarantees, because children are not like adults, and we have to be more careful. And the last one was the possibility or not for minors to exercise their rights without interventions of their parents, because children they have their own privacy, and they have to have the ability to exercise their rights alone, and sometimes without their parents. And you know that for children to know where is the website of the CNIL and to go to the complaints page and to send a complaint, it's something which is very difficult. And that's why we think we have to work with all the stakeholders to imagine some new way for the minors to know their rights, and where the rights are not respected, how could they complain to anyone, to the CNIL, but not only to the CNIL, and sometimes without their parents. And that's a lot of questions. Maybe we'll have answers after that, but we are thinking on all these questions. And regarding our works at the Innovation and Foresight Lab, our idea is to publish a recommendation on the second semester of 2020, if it's possible. And at the same time, I wanted to talk about UX design, because we have published 1 year ago the Innovation and Foresight report, which was called Shaping Choices in the Digital World. From dark patterns to data protection, the influence of UX UI design on user empowerment, which explores the challenges related to the design of digital services. And our main idea was that the interface is the first object of mediation between the law, rights, and individuals. And you know that the GDPR has in its article 25 the privacy by design, which is not dedicated to designer, but we think we could use it to work with designer on the specific interface, and how could we make it more privacy friendly, and to co-build some privacy friendly design practices. After the report, you can, in which we explore all the attention economy, the dark patterns, the nudge, and all the systems which have been created not for the rights of the children, but more for the commercial purpose or for the business of the big platforms. We think that it could be possible to work with the designers to invent some new systems, some new UX design, UI, UX interfaces, to make it more easy for the people to understand what is done with their data and how could they make their rights respected. And we have published in June a website which is called design.cnil.fr, which is a platform dedicated to the designer interested by the GDPR and wants to co-build user journeys compliant with the GDPR and respectful of privacy. And the idea is that we have to work with designer to make the people know about their data protection, not only in the privacy policy, but on all the UX experience, and to put the right information at the right moment in a way which respects at the same time the company or maybe the public service, the law and the people. Because the only way for the people to understand the GDPR is not the privacy policy. Privacy is a good thing, but it's not sufficient. And just to create some different interfaces could be a good idea. And with the designer, we don't want to explain all the GDPR, but just 3 key concepts, which are information, consent, and rights, and to explain them what the GDPR asks them to do and how could they try to make it better. And we organize some workshops, and we are trying to provide some tools to think privacy within UX, such as these cards, to make them think while they are working on the interface. And we are going to publish some tools, some animation kit for the workshops, and to share some case studies. At this point, we haven't worked on the specific case of children, but we think it could be a good idea to make it possible for the industry, or in learning analytics, or maybe in video games, or and so on, and the social media. Try to think about the GDPR and the right of children in the interface, and not just to know if they have to consent or if the parents have to consent. But the most important thing is to educate the children even in the interface. Thank you.
Thank you. So I surveyed colleagues outside of France, because we've just heard from the CNIL, to look at what supervisory authorities are doing in the area of children's data. As you'd expect, there is a lot of variety, ranging from some authorities, some data protection authorities, who have no guidance specifically focusing on this, through to others like the UK and the Irish, where they have ambitious statutory obligations placed on them to develop large codes of practice tackling all things to do with children's personal data. If you look at the guidance which has been issued by data protection authorities, then I think you can divide it into 4 thematic areas. So the first area is to do with parental consent and Article 8. So no surprises that there is a significant focus on that. However, there is a clear awareness where authorities have issued guidance on that this is just one element of the way that GDPR is relevant for children's data, and that the provisions dealing with parental consent when you are providing information society services directly to children, and where consent is the lawful basis for processing, there is a clear awareness that this is just one topic among many, and that it shouldn't dominate the debate. And I think that's also actually very apparent from the panel today. There's hardly been a mention of Article 8. There have been many other issues that are as important or more important. So that's the first theme. The second thematic area is guidance for, or a focus on, use of data in schools and in the education sector. So very much as Jen has highlighted, there's an awareness that a lot of data is collected there, but there is a need for guidance and controls. And again, as Jen has mentioned, we've also seen enforcement and case law in that area, specifically on the use of facial recognition, for example, in France and in Sweden. The third thematic area I would describe as almost sort of pedagogical. So this could range from materials aimed directly at children, so guidance, videos, there's material from the Hungarian authority on that, there's a whole website in Spain. Or it could be lesson plans and materials aimed at teachers. So the Irish DPC ran a consultation in this area last year, and they have released sample lesson plans for teachers to use to engage with their classes, to raise awareness, perhaps tackling some of the issues that the CNIL are looking at about the fact that children won't think necessarily to go to a data protection authority, so you need to engage in other ways. The fourth area is the sort of the omnibus codes, so the very broad, all-encompassing codes tackling a very wide spectrum. And here we've heard about the CNIL's plans. The Irish are due to make an announcement on this shortly, following the consultation which they ran last year. And of course, this morning, interesting timing for the panel today, we had the ICO's age-appropriate design code being published. I was going to pick up on just 3 points in that, not least because although I'm a fast reader, I'm not that fast a reader. So the 3 points I thought were worth sharing were, first of all, just to remind everybody that the scope of the code is not children under 13 or the relevant age for Article 8. The scope is much more ambitious. It looks at children under the age of 18. So that would be the first point to be aware of. The second point, which I think will also be relevant for other codes like the Irish or like the CNIL guidance, is whether you target the guidance at sites or materials or controllers who are deliberately targeting children. So whether you focus on child-directed sites or whether you go wider than that, whether you give guidance which applies to sites where children are likely to visit the site or even where it's just possible. And there are obvious pitfalls in just looking at child-directed sites, because there will be many other sites where there will be a lot of kids going to that site or interacting with that particular service, but they may not be child-directed. And if you exclude those from the scope of the code or the guidance, then there's a significant gap. So the ICO, Age-Appropriate Design Code, looks at all online services where it is likely, so it's where it's more probable than not, that children will be interacting with the site. So there's a very broad scope. But that broad scope then brings with it certain challenges for organisations. So just to give you an example, the code has very high standards in the area of data sharing, privacy by default, and especially commercialisation of data. So there are comments in some parts of the code that suggest that any kind of commercialisation of children's data is unlikely to be justifiable. Well, this could then be quite challenging for news media, for example, where it is likely that there could be children visiting the site. For those media organisations whose business model involves personalised advertising, they will have some issues to work through there. Do they change their business model across the board to avoid that kind of targeting, which there might be an argument for, but there will be a commercial impact to doing that? Or alternatively, do they age gate and say that children can't use the site, or introduce two different versions of the service, one for children, one for adults? And there are significant implications for the business and for children, depending on which option they choose there. So it's a complicated area where you are balancing the scope of the code with how ambitious the protections are. And then the third area I was going to highlight in the code is age verification, which the CNIL has already suggested is an area that they're going to focus on, which is difficult. And here, ICO looks at self-declaration, but they're somewhat skeptical about that. They do look at AI or online techniques for trying to guess the age of a child or the individual who's interacting with you. They suggest possible third-party verification services or use of official documentation. Of course, all of these bring with them privacy design challenges, and there is an inherent challenge there, both to privacy and security, if you're collecting more data in order to assess the age of the individual with whom you're interacting. There's also a particular challenge, given that the age-appropriate design code is not just looking at whether you are 18, or which side of that you are, or which side of 13 or 16 you are. It groups children into different age groups and recommends, quite understandably, that you gauge your compliance based on the particular age group you're dealing with. But the problems of verifying a child's age are actually harder in that situation, because there will be less official documentation, for example, if that's the route that's appropriate, to actually tell the difference between a child who is potentially 11 or 15, where different services and different uses of data may be appropriate. So these are just some of the challenges that the age-appropriate design code throws out there. In some cases it has solutions, in others it's very much posing the questions that organisations need to work through. So I think it's an area that we'll have to persevere with and keep coming back to. I think the code will generate a lot of discussion and a lot of supplementary guidance.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jürgen Bänsch. I'm the Public Affairs Director of ISFE. Maybe just to start a few words about ISFE, Interactive Software Federation. We are the European umbrella association that represents the video game industry in Brussels. We have a direct membership of companies that are the main European distributors of video games. The brands you can see on the slide. We also represent national trade associations in 15 European countries, and those countries are the yellow dots on the screen. Before I start, maybe also sort of a disclaimer. In what follows, I talk about implementation of the GDPR in general in our sector. As you can imagine, GDPR implementation differs slightly from one company to another company. So my presentation will relate to main features of the implementation in regarding to children's privacy. Games are increasingly being played on a wide range of devices. Our main business model is the provision of gameplay on those devices. So we do that in three market segments. First of all, online download, which is the strongest growth market segment. Secondly, mobile apps, mobile games in the app world. And thirdly, the classical offline games. I want to stress here that we are not an advertising-driven industry. So advertising obviously exists in our industry, but it's mostly first-party advertising, so advertising being done by the company itself. And secondly, it's also mostly contextual advertising. That doesn't mean that there is no profiling in our sector. However, it is of marginal importance. So what type of data are being collected in general in our industry? I've listed this data in terms of importance. First of all, gameplay data is extremely important. This is the data generated when the player plays a game. Gameplay data allows us not only to identify problems within the game, but also allows us to ensure that the game remains attractive. It is increasingly important to ensure that the game is not too difficult, because then you will lose players, but also that the game is difficult enough. It cannot be too easy at the same time. So there is a constant monitoring service that tries to find the right balance between the two. Gameplay data, for instance, also allows us to create matchmaking, bringing two players of similar skill together to ensure that their play is as enjoyable as possible. The second category of data is network and device data. This is data of a more technical nature, and that enables the gameplay being executed. This includes obviously also cookies and data being collected on basis of cookies. If you want to play a game, usually you need to sign up and create an account. And in doing so, you will provide the company personal data. And if necessary, you will also need to provide some payment data. So that is the type of data that we collect as well. Communication and social interaction data is also, to a certain level, important. Many of the games allow for auxiliary communication features, whereby players can communicate with each other during gameplay. This sometimes is necessary to play the game, especially when you play in groups against other groups. There is also communication features that allow to communicate with the service provider if you want to flag issues or problems. So this type of data enables communication, but it's also data collected from monitoring of that type of communication, as monitoring chat rooms is a standard practice as well that we use to protect players from illegal conduct. And then, finally, maybe the most controversial part is the data provided by third parties. This is done on a minimal basis. Examples here are, for instance, third-party service providers that provide anti-fraud services in order to combat IP infringements. But it can also be, for instance, some companies allowing social media to connect to your account, or enabling the possibility of to sign in and create an account based on your social media account. That is another possibility. As I said before, communication between one data controller to the other data controller happens not very often. So how do we identify children? I know that the age-appropriate design code was published this morning, but I'm sorry to say that most of the identification is still being done on self-declaration. So when you sign up to create an account, the date of birth will decide whether or not you are allowed to create a standard normal account for adults, or if that would not be the case, then there are three possibilities. Either you get directed to the option of creating a child account. So this is an account where the adult can supervise a child. Either you cannot sign up and you cannot play the game. And the third possibility is that you can play the game in an offline mode with no connection to the internet. Supervised child accounts are implemented on most of the devices these days. So that is, for us, in any case, the preferred option. In this sense, the child tries to create the account, but the account needs to be finalized and confirmed by either a parent or a guardian, and he needs to opt in for consent-based data processing activities that will happen on the account. And I've listed those on the slides. So in many cases, the parent needs to opt in for the sharing of gameplay data, for the sharing of user-generated content, the ability to link with friends, the ability to link accounts with social media, and so on. There is a last and maybe more new possibility is that more and more companies are developing specific child accounts which are game-based. These are accounts where they do not need to have parents' supervision, but obviously all of these opt-in possibilities are not implemented on those accounts. Parental control tools in our industry also allows for other types of control and monitoring. I'm sure you're familiar with this. You can limit the amount of time being spent by children playing games. You can allow or control the amount of spending. You can filter on an age-based level the type of games, the type of content that a child can see. We have been promoting especially parental dialogue in this context. So we think that informing children about privacy risks and explaining children what privacy means exactly in a technical context is being best done in a parent-child interaction. And that's also why we are running currently campaigns, awareness campaigns in 7 European countries, where we want to promote more and more the use of parental controls and the interaction, the engagement of parents with their children. We support parents that want to play games together with their children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was really a comprehensive intervention, and I think very helpful to have this distinction of kind of data and personal data that you are able to collect. I would now open the floor for questions. Yes, I see one.
Gloria González Fuster, thank you very much. All the presentations were very, very interesting. Just following on this, the last one, the slide with the list of data is very, very useful. So thank you for this one. And my question would be, do you know which is the lawful ground for processing the most used? Is it consent, legitimate interest for the different types of data? And following on this question for the CNIL, I really like the idea that you're thinking about data subject rights also for children. And I think the two most important are the right to withdraw consent when there's consent, and then the right to object. And I think the right to object is very interesting because it's one of the most difficult ones to explain. You have to explain you have the right to say that you have an interest that overweights the legitimate interest unless it doesn't. So are you also trying to explain the right to object to children? Thank you.
That's a bit difficult to answer. I think in terms of children's data, the most used legal ground is consent. In general, it's difficult to say. That depends really on the type of data being processed. I think in general it might be legitimate interests. A lot of the data I've shown on the slide really are technical data allowing to provide the service. And their legitimate interest would be the most used ground.
Just to answer on the second question, I think, on objects, connected object, it was the question. Yeah, we had some works on it because we had some, we have in our laboratory, try some objects for children and to try to understand what are the problems. And it's more problems of security. And we had, you had this Kyla in Germany 2 years ago, we had some problem with Bluetooth, and we tried to make the security more respected in the collected objects. It won't. The right to object. To object. Okay, it was. Sorry. No, and the right object. No, we have to. We are working on the consent, but at this point, we don't know exactly what will be the issue of the consultation. That's why I can't say anything at this point. I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Garland Green, the Director of Technology for the International School of Brussels. And I would like to, first of all, thank you for contributing to the amount of information and the work that you do that those of us that are boots on the ground, if you will, can draw on. And any amount of effort that is put in to look into data privacy with children, I would argue is God's work and is a very much appreciated work on our part. What we discover as we're trying to fight the headwinds of an already existing industry in which the consumption of children's data has been going on for a long period of time is that we have to find a way to teach a new literacy to the educators who are coming out of school or those educators that have already been here. Now, this is a new literacy. We would argue that it probably should have been taught before that, but through the GDPR, this is a new literacy that has now been put into the portfolios of every educator, to say nothing about the leadership within each individual building. I think the leadership is a harder sell because teachers are on the ground. They see their data subjects every day, and they take that very seriously. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to bring a level of support through the GDPR. We have, for example, a very active and robust digital citizenship program in which we've just sent 2 of our librarians to become DPO certified. And we're starting to do that pressure. My question to all of you, and again to thank you again for your work, is it's one thing to identify what challenges need to be done. From your vantage point of having done the research, doing the gaming, and putting this together, what are the first best steps for the educators in the room to take a transformative leap forward in protecting children's data, something that we all agree we must do?
Who would like to answer that?
Okay, thank you for that question, and I have a positive answer and a negative answer. So the thing I would love schools to do, and Jen I think might agree, is to become good practitioners and ethical practitioners of children's data themselves. Because I think if children see every day that they understand within the school how their data is being treated, and if they feel their rights are being respected there, and things are explained to them there, then they will gain the standards and the expectations that they can then at least take out into the rest of the world. My more negative comment, if I may, is to say I think it's fabulous that educators are taking on part of the problem, and that's why we built the toolkit, and that's, I think, lots of people are building resources to explain to children. But that was what I was trying to say about children's fatalism, and I think justified fatalism in relation to where their data goes. Because if what they learn and what you teach them is that their data is going to places that they cannot have access to because they will be beyond jurisdiction of our DPAs, or that if they exercise that control, they cannot have the service. They cannot be where their friends are. They cannot be part of the digital world. Then what they will learn is that they have no rights and that they have no power. And I think it's a very difficult task for teachers to teach children that actually their power is incredibly limited in practice.
Okay. So Sonia's really addressed that as a digital citizenship question. How do teachers become that conduit for digital citizenship? I'd only add to that there's very good Council of Europe materials being published very recently on that. I would like to address it from a different angle, and I think it's very important that teachers are also the conduit to the access to these companies. And for the most part, teachers, even if they have good data protection and privacy training, which is entirely absent in England's teacher training program at the moment, they cannot be expected to understand the nuances of how apps and platforms work. The Oxford Computer Science Institute in the last year, and colleague Jun Zhao will soon bring out research on this, found that over 90% of apps are sending data to Google, and about 70 or so percent to Facebook. There is no way that teachers understand the nuances of how these apps are built. And so when coders and developers build apps, they often borrow code. So like Lego blocks, they go to somebody else's design and borrow a bit and add it into their coding structure. They don't necessarily understand themselves how these apps work and what the instructions that they've put into their app will do. They know that it might do some tracking and analytics, but they don't follow exactly where that data goes. So teachers can't understand that. I mean, it's simply impossible to expect that. So I would ask, actually, that the teaching profession starts to look at it together with your staff when you look at employing tools and apps in schools, that you think of it much more holistically as part of your procurement process, that you work together with the IT staff. And, for example, along with the Committee on the Rights of the Child General Comment number 16 in 2013, they put state obligations on the business sector to assess the impact of business procurement decisions on children. And you could look at things like then how the terms and conditions are if you're publishing them. So do you put, for example, your data protection impact assessment, your terms and conditions, excluding or redacting commercial sensitivities, and the privacy statement on a website for parents to be able to understand and for those that want to go and explore it? Can you be more transparent about what you actually are engaging with all these third parties actually means for a child? And, for example, what representation and remedy children have and parents have if they feel that a product is unsuitable for a school to use. And to come back to the right to object, that's where the schools have a really important role, because at the moment, public task is used for most of this processing, but in fact, the company's products really are relying on consent, which is simply not being collected. There's a great deal of unlawful processing going on, and it's not, I would suggest, the fault of the schools. It's simply a collective, holistic failure to understand what sort of processing goes on. And we need, I think, different sort of legislation that addresses much more narrowly what teachers expect and parents and children should expect of the reasonable processing that a school is allowed to perform as part of a public task, and what should remain outside of that public task and can only be performed through the contract with a third party. And I think we need a lot more better understanding of that, really, through transparency. So you could start as a school to say, We'll be transparent about procurement process, here's the terms and conditions, here's our documents, and also publish a data usage report. So tell children, here are the products that we signed you up to, here's their terms and conditions, and at the end of leaving a school, a child should know exactly where their digital footprint has gone.
Just to pick up on that point, the fact that schools should have more information and should teach to children about privacy. This is very important to put in the curriculum, and there was a book made by the VUB that is called Handbook on How to Teach Privacy at Schools. So this is something that it's in a very plain and simple form on how this can be done by teachers. And also knowing that, for example, the European schools, they adopt a specific application for mathematics that is called Matific. There we can see a lot of nudging techniques, and maybe now with the recommendations of the IC code, we have to see some changes on how this is addressed in the future about these nudging techniques. But I think there was a question also at the end. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Vera Mor. I'm a law student from the University of Oslo. And so I had one follow-up question and one individual question. The first, doesn't Article, I think, 8 of the GDPR provides consent as the only lawful legal basis for processing of children's data? So how can we use legitimate interest? And the second, we were wondering how to define children's data. Does data concerning their parents, is that an inherent part of a child's data? So how do you define a child's data? Thank you.
No, you go.
So on Article 8, what this says is that if you are providing an information society service directly to a child, so it has to be an online service, usually provided for remuneration. It has to be provided direct to the child, so many of the school services that Jen was discussing wouldn't be covered in the first place because they're provided via the school. But if you are interacting directly with a child, then Article 8 says that if your ground for processing is consent, and if the child you're dealing with is under the relevant age, then you need parental consent. So it doesn't say whether or not you need consent. It says if you need consent, then you have to go to the parent if the child is too young. So it leaves open the question of whether you could be processing data based on consent, where you have questions about the capacity of the child to give consent, whether you could be processing based on contractual necessity, where you've got questions about whether the child can actually validly enter into a contract, or whether the justification is legitimate interests or indeed public task. It doesn't actually answer that question.
Thank you. We had just one more question before our concluding remarks. It was, yes, if you can have the microphone there. It was, take two more questions.
Well, thank you very much for the panel. Just I would like to know what are your thoughts, because you have been, you have been talking about the use of data by third parties, enterprises, also governments, etc. No? But also what concerns me is the use of data by other children. I mean, especially in school or whatever, they load a lot of pictures, and I think also it's important to draw attention of the use of data by other children and how it can be misused. Thanks.
Maybe we can have another, the other question, and then the panel can take them, the missing one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the last question. So I'm Juan Agoga, I'm a CNRS researcher, and I'm a computer scientist. So what we developed in our team is a tool, a platform that collects the ads that people are receiving when they browse their Facebook profiles. And we are currently doing lots of analysis on the kind of ads people are receiving, and I have two questions. One is, are there any laws that are prohibiting some sorts of ads to be shown to children? Are there any laws saying like this ad should not reach this person? And the second question is, are there any studies in psychology that are investigating the impact these kind of ads are having on children's mental health or choices.
Would like to take up some of the questions?
I can say something about this. Yes, is the short answer to your question. There is a whole legal framework in Europe regarding providing content to children that may impair children, or the Visual Media Services Directive, for instance, has been updated in regard to audiovisual content and video sharing platforms. And in addition to that, there's a whole legal framework based on self-regulation on advertising codes. This is actually not just self-regulation, it is co-regulation with standards in relation to the amount of ads that you can show on the television during this and this hour and so forth. So there is a lot of regulation there.
Are there regulations also for ads on Facebook in the digital world, or they are mostly specific to TV ads, and is there an update in regulations?
I don't know the details of that. I would think so, at least these regulations are in the process. I would advise you to go to the European Advertising Standards Alliance website, which is the umbrella association that governs codes of conduct in the advertising sector.
I mean, just to add, I agree. I think the trade associations for advertising have had regulations for a long time, so members of the organisations should be complying with those codes. I was going to comment on the history of psychological research on the impact of advertising of certain kinds of products. So most often these are products, junk food, as we're not supposed to call it, in relation to children's health and obesity is probably the biggest area of research, but there's been all kinds of research also on gender stereotyping and the effect of in advertisements and the effect of that on children, and it's a long tradition. It does indeed start in the days when advertising was mainly on television, so that's the biggest body of research, and that the research on advertising in games and on social media and online platforms is more recent. It's contested. There are some difficulties in establishing that advertising straightforwardly produces harm, and perhaps one of the most obvious is that it takes children 20 years to grow up, and it depends, are you looking for an immediate effect or a long-term effect? Most often what we're looking at is cumulative effects of advertising along with all the other cultural factors which shape a child's outcomes and socialization. So it's part of the story, but it's never an overwhelming factor.
Thank you.
Okay, I think for the concluding remarks, then
it was the last.
Okay. Yes.
The first question we didn't. Then I think we didn't answer to the first question.
Yeah.
It was about privacy between children. It's not about GDPR, but it's part of the process, I think. And that's why at the CNIL we tried not to focus only on the GDPR, but on the education, digital education. And we think that it's a good, and you have to educate the young people and their parents, because there's not only the children. Sometimes we make the mistake because sometimes the parents have some way of using the social media who are not the best way to use it, and that's why we think that we have to at the same level of the education on GDPR, we have to use it as a good toolkit to educate to the digital in general, and the surveillance by the others it's as more important, and that's why we think it's not you don't have to deal of one subject without the other, but it's not the GDPR, but it's useful, I think.
Okay, thank you. So the idea of the panel was also to bring more awareness about the fundamental right to privacy, and not everything to go around data protection. So I think there we see a trend that there is more awareness about privacy. Do the panel has any concluding remarks? 30 seconds, 1 minute.
Okay, I'd like to leave everyone with a challenge because underneath a lot of our concerns, and perhaps driving a lot of our concerns, is a question about harm. And a lot of the regulation is risk-based. And the question then is, what is the harm, which the different kinds of dimensions of data collection in children's lives might matter. And I think we don't really explore this. So we hear it in one way in relation to how children might infringe each other's privacy, and another in relation to advertising, and another in relation to data breaches. There are lots of kinds of harm floating around. I would really love this conference next year to come back and give us a sense of where the harm lies and how we're going to measure it and how we're going to be confident of it, because then I think we have a much stronger call on both education and regulation.
I'd also give you something to do or something to think about is what kind of language are we using when we talk to children about the internet? Have you, as a leading internet company has done, made it routine in your house to say, we'll Google something if you don't know it, instead of we'll make an online search? You know, can you actually justify using sort of a particular company's brand in your language every day? We're not, I think, addressing the values that these companies are introducing into our children's lives on a day-to-day basis. We're not addressing how their lives are being shaped. For example, we can't talk to Alexa or Siri the same way that you talk to your pet or your parent. If you listen to your children talking to these electronic devices, they change their language and their style and their wording and how they have to repeat things and say them in a different tone. What kind of effect is that having on children? And most importantly, what kind of effect are the hundreds and hundreds of companies and commercial entities having, not only in terms of children's lives and education, but on shaping the entire education system? What values are we placing on coding, on computer science, and at what cost of potentially of the arts and other important subjects in a child's rounded education? So I think we have to start making more informed choices, not only in terms of what we're telling children and how we're speaking to them, but actually in our own lives of what we expect, and realize that all this technology and all this data collection is not inevitable. They are choices that companies make, and we can make choices how we influence that. We should be making choices at the moment with our children. Too often we make them on behalf of our children, and we don't fully understand the implications that has for their lifetime.
I don't have much to say, but maybe it's not about the jihad, but maybe we could try to think and co-create the solutions with the children, I think, because most of the time we have some adults talking about children, and I think the first workshop you represented were a good example of how could we work with the children to find solutions, because I don't think we have to just to think without them.
At the beginning of the age-appropriate design code, Elizabeth Denham makes the point that 1 in 5 users online is going to be a child. And she says that if you fast forward 10 or 20 years, we'll look back and say, it's bizarre that this wasn't designed for children, given that there's such a significant proportion of online use. But when you read the code, you have a lot of questions, at least I do, and I start to say, but, how are people going to do this? So my point would be, suggest to CPDP that, as Sara said, that there's a focus on this next year or the year after, because I think there'll be a lot more discussion on the points. I think the code is just a start.
I'd like you to leave with another thought. If you visit the annual game trade show, which is called Gamescom in Cologne, you will see mostly children queuing up to play a game, for a new version of the game for 20 minutes. The queues usually are 3, 4, 5, and 6 hours long. That's not an exception. Children do that. So I always say that we do not have consumers. We have basically fan communities. Children are extremely dedicated to gaming products. I do not like when we talk about personal data of children that people always refer to one and the same business model, which is the stealing of personal data of a child and selling it to another company. There is a whole world out there of digital services offered to children and adults that actually do not want to do that, and that want to honor the confidence that they get from their consumers. So I think we need to start talking much more about the need to process personal data, because the real problem that we're facing here is that all data is almost personal data, right? So there is a need really to talk about the processing of data that is needed to provide a service, and that you need to process as a company, while at the same time taking into account as much as possible the interest of the consumers as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and apologies for